So we're here this morning with Burke Teichert, and Burke, you're retired as the General Manager and Vice President of Agri Reserve, and you've run some very, very large ranches in your lifetime. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you've been in terms of your ranching and grazing philosophy, and where you are today, and why you've transitioned in your thought process about how to graze cattle and how to manage the soil?
Well, years and years ago, I was introduced to Alan Savory, probably one of the first in the United States that was introduced to him, and went to some of his courses and began to do some rotational grazing, if I can call it that today. And I think we made some progress. I think we could document roughly any place between 12 and 25% additional stocking rate carrying capacity. But I never stepped it up to the level I should have. And when I retired, I started filling a role as a consultant and speaker, and oftentimes when I would do speaking assignments, I would run into really good grazers, and I started to notice a tremendous difference between grazing a little bit better and grazing a lot better. And if I discovered two things that I think are really, really important, one was the importance of recovery time, and I think many of us that were into the grazing early, our recovery periods were too short for wherever we are, whether it was here in a higher rainfall area or back west where most of my work was in lower rainfall areas. I think our recoveries were just not long enough, because the plants that we most desired to have in abundance, they weren't getting enough chance to recover. Right. And the other one was that I don't think I placed enough emphasis on the value of animal impact, and which is accomplished through good stock density for brief periods of time. And so those two things, and now in my consulting work, I really get emphatic about those 2 points. Out west, stock density is not easy to achieve. You have to maybe do it selectively and pick your times and your places. Mm-hmm. But we can work with the recovery time, and I think must work with the recovery time, and then do the best we can with stock densities and animal impact, and pick places where you think it can do you some good quickly, and move from there. So that's kind of where I've been and where I've come from and gone to.
Burke, as I said earlier, you've been responsible in your lifetime for managing very, very large ranches, and in different parts of the world, the U.S. Right. And so you have experience in multiple environments, from arid and semi-arid environments to very temperate environments and very hot and humid environments. And relative to that, though, because you were directly responsible, you had a fiscal responsibility in what you were doing in managing these ranches. So talk a little bit about, in terms of ranch economics and finances, what this type of grazing, the advantages that it gives you relative to what your bottom line.
There's several things that come to mind real quickly. One, anytime you pick up your grazing management and get it better, you tend to combine herds and make herds larger.
Yes.
And it's much easier for one man to tend 800 cows in one herd than 800 cows in 8 herds.
Right.
And 800 cows in one herd is plenty doable, because we've seen that happen.
Yes.
In multiple situations. And I'm just using that 800 because that tended to be kind of an optimum size in some of the operations that I managed. Water availability and how many can I work and process in a day can be and so forth. But that doesn't have to be the magic number. It's just one that worked for us in certain situations. But that's the first thing. And then so cows per man ratio becomes really, really important in ranch economics, just because the salary is not the only cost of having a person on a payroll. You got pickups and you got housing and you've got tools and equipment, etc.
Right.
In most Western ranches, saddle horses. And time you put that whole cost structure together, it's at least twice the salary, if not a little more than that. And so cows per man ratio becomes a real big thing. That becomes a really important ratio. And then grazing so greatly facilitates lengthening the grazing season.
Yes.
And shortening the feeding season.
Yes. And
sometimes eliminating the feeding season, especially as we move south of I-80 or I-70. And fed feed versus graze feed has tremendous economic significance. And grazing facilitates that. You're going to have adaptive grazing is going to have green growth happening throughout a longer portion of the year. And then if you learn how to stockpile as part of your grazing planning, you can get through a brief period where there may be nothing green for a little while. So that works. And then the other thing that has such power, acres per cow.
Acres per cow.
Acres per cow. Those three ratios drive a lot of economic power. So acres per cow. And if I can, with a little fence and water, double the stocking rate, I've just bought another ranch for the price of a little stock water development and fence.
It's a pretty cheap price per acre, isn't it?
That's a much lower cost per acre. I've never asked Steve that question, but a friend of mine out in near Baker, Montana, he was 30 acres per cow. Now he's 16. And he said, I've spent about $50 an acre in fence and stock water development. And
so now wait a minute.
He said, so I've just bought another ranch.
Exactly.
For $50 an acre.
For $50 an acre.
And I don't have to pay property tax on this one. And I didn't have to add a pickup. I didn't have to add a man. I didn't have to add a saddle horse. It takes a little longer now when we brand our calves. It takes a little longer when we ship. It takes a little longer when we preg check because there's more of them. But other than those few days a year, we're essentially the same manpower we always were. And he said the fact that we moved cattle daily with temporary fence, then when he was telling me he's daily now, but it was about every 3 days. But he said, we don't have as much work to do. He says, I don't know where the other work disappeared to, but we don't have as much work to do as we used to have to do. Despite the fact we're building a little poly pits, nearly every day.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The very objection that we often raise as to why we can't do this, that it's actually going to take me a lot more time that I don't have, becomes the very thing that ends up saving us a lot of time.
Saving an awful lot of time, yeah. A little over a year ago, I brought a small tour group here to visit Steve and Judy. It was actually, I think, about mid-April. There wasn't a leaf on a tree yet. And the neighbors had grass growth maybe 3 or 4 inches. And yet these cows were standing in belly deep grass in the middle of April and not a leaf on a tree yet. And it was green grass. It wasn't last year's stockpile. It was green grass.
But now wait a minute, Burke. Surely Steve and Judy must have dumped a lot of fertilizer or done something their neighbors didn't know about, right?
I'm sure the neighbors thought that. But I verified that they hadn't. Yeah, they had fertilizer, but it was more the organic kind.
Right.
The manure, and it was the trampled plant material and so forth that was the fertility.
Exactly. How hard is it, Burke, for those of us that have been ranchers for a long time, for the average rancher, how hard is it for us to transition our thought process, to change our mind about how we graze and what we're doing?
I think for the average rancher, it's really hard for some reason or another. I think the very first point you made, I think it's the human mindset that we have to work on quite a lot, just to try to get people to understand that they can do this, and that it's not high cost, and it's not a big time consumer. You spend a little time and a little money and some infrastructure up front, but the payback is pretty rapid. But I think people's minds have to get wrapped around that to be able to go forward.